Today is November 10th, 2024. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and I want to talk about how the US presidential election is going to impact both it and US foreign policy in general, because the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is just one part of a much wider US foreign policy. It is a foreign policy that stretches back all the way to the end of the Cold War, where the US emerged as the sole superpower. And the US has pursued this foreign policy ever since, regardless of who sits in the White House and regardless of who controls Congress. And that includes during the previous 4 years of the Trump administration. And this all goes back to this New York Times article, 1992. There are many papers, policy papers, news articles about this spanning decades. This is just the most obvious, most thorough explanation of US foreign policy post-Cold War that has continued to present day. Let's just read through a little bit of this. A 46-page document that has been circulating at the highest levels of the Pentagon for weeks, and which Defense Secretary Dick Cheney expects to release later this month, states that part of the American mission will be convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. This is the cementing of the US-led rules-based international order that we still hear about to this day. And again, regardless of who is president and regardless of who controls Congress, regardless of Democrat or Republican, regardless of Trump or Biden or Obama or Harris. The classified document makes the case for a world dominated by one superpower, the United States, obviously, whose position can be perpetuated by what they're calling constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. And this is what has defined US foreign policy for decades, from 1992 to present day. And again, every single presidential administration, including the last 4 years of the Trump administration. And in this New York Times article from 1992, they actually do reference multipolarism, but instead of calling it multipolarism, they're calling it collective internationalism, a balance of power between nations. And it says, to perpetuate this role, the United States must sufficiently account for the interests of the advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order, the document states. With its focus on this concept of benevolent domination by one power, the Pentagon document articulates the clearest rejection to date of collective internationalism, the rejection of multipolarism, which is what the United States still to this day does. And again, regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, regardless of whether it is President-elect Donald Trump, Vice President Kamala Harris, current President Joe Biden, whether it was the Obama administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, or the Bush senior administration, to which this article is referring to. So they're saying that collective internationalism is a strategy that emerged from World War II, when the 5 victorious powers sought to form a United Nations that could mediate disputes and police outbreaks of violence. So what the US wants to do is dominate this process, and that is clearly what they have worked for decades to do. That is how it is right now, and we can see now that it is being challenged and transformed back to collective internationalism, or as it is called now, multipolarism. When the United States, again, regardless of who it is, whether it is Trump himself, the war hawks he surrounds himself with, whether it was Kamala Harris during the campaign, or US President Joe Biden at any speech that he has given over the last 4 years, when they talk about Russia, Iran, and China being adversaries, being revisionists, challenging the US-led international order, as Mark Sloboda always puts it, where the US makes the rules and gives the orders. The problem the United States has with these nations it calls adversaries is the fact that they seek collective internationalism. They seek multipolarism. They seek a balance of power between nations rather than accept a world dominated by the United States, a world in which the United States dictates to other nations around the globe, thousands of miles from US shores and borders, tells these nations how they're going to run their own internal political affairs, how they're going to manage their foreign policy with other nations along their borders and far beyond them. This is obviously unacceptable. No nation should accept this. All nations should defend themselves against this unwarranted overreach of power. Illegal under the international law the US itself claims that it upholds. And that is what every US administration, in one way or another, has pursued, this policy of asserting US primacy over the planet. And that includes President-elect Donald Trump during his first 4 years in office, and it is what he himself has promised he will do in the next 4 years in office. And I want to show you this. This is the America First Policy Initiative. I'm sorry, it is the America First Policy Institute. I'm gonna keep accidentally saying initiative. And this is the America First agenda, and you see it has all of these pillars. A lot of these pillars deal with internal American politics and policies. Okay, fair enough. The American people and the special interests within American borders can run their own affairs in any way they want. But what does it say about foreign policy? And this is under Pillar 6, deliver peace through strength and American leadership. American leadership. What they're talking about is America's leadership of the entire planet. Who elected them the leader? What entitles them to lead the rest of the world? Why does the rest of the world have to answer to the United States? This America First Policy Initiative, linked to President-elect Donald Trump, who has raised funds for this institute. This is what it says. The American victories in World War II and the Cold War, going back to that New York Times article, referring to neocon foreign policy from then up until now, established the US as the last best hope for man on Earth. Who around the globe has agreed to that? Freedom's cause in every part of the world depends upon a strong America. Again, according to who? Who decided that? When our country is secure, we can advance American security abroad with greater confidence. What entitles the United States to advance anything abroad beyond its own borders, and by implication within the boundaries and spheres of influence of other nations? The US has a unique role in the world, again, appointed by whom? And our nation has an unmatched ability to do best for others when its people are strong, safe, and prosperous. Well, if you think about it, America is able to meddle much better abroad if everything is stable and prosperous at home. That is true. That doesn't excuse meddling abroad, however. An American First approach demands that any commitments of American lives or dollars abroad come with concrete benefits for the American people. So what they're saying is we are not above or beyond meddling abroad. We just want to make sure that it benefits the American people. Nothing that they propose here or anything that President-elect Donald Trump has ever said before his first 4 years in office, during his 4 years in office, ever since, including campaigning and winning this election, nothing he has actually said ever articulated a way in which US meddling abroad would somehow benefit the average American. But that's what he's promising because he's a politician. He's telling you what you want to hear to secure your support, and then he will continue doing whatever he and the special interests he answers to want to do once he's in office. Then they get to the real point. You continue reading. We must also maintain the world's most powerful military force and return our armed forces to their core missions of deterrence and warfighting. Warfighting where? Who on planet Earth threatens the United States within its actual territory? Nobody. Additionally, we must pursue a bold new path to peace and prosperity in the Middle East. Who appointed the United States arbiter of what happens in the Middle East? Nobody. Nobody that I know of. And hold China accountable for its aggression against its neighbors, lack of transparency, and other actions. So this is, again, the America First policy initiative saying the U.S. must hold China accountable for its aggression against its neighbors. Once again, what business is it of the United States what happens in the Asia-Pacific region, literally on the other side of planet Earth from where the US is located on a map? Number two, the narrative that China is aggressive against its neighbors is a fabricated narrative spread by the Obama and Biden administrations and repeated enthusiastically by the Trump administration, his first 4 years in office, and all of the war hawks he has surrounded himself with, including this time around, continue repeating this fabricated narrative. China is not aggressive towards its neighbors. Its neighbors count China as their most important and largest trade partner among all other nations on Earth. There are maritime disputes, but as I pointed out many times before, there are maritime disputes between all nations that have claims over waters around the globe. France and the UK had a maritime dispute not long ago where they each mobilized their respective navies. This happens, it gets heated, but otherwise these countries have solid relations with one another. Nothing even close to resembling actual conflict ever happens, and the same goes for these maritime disputes between China and its neighbors. And maritime disputes these other nations all have with one another as well, not just with China. So this is a false narrative that President-elect Donald Trump has repeated during his last 4 years in office, is repeating once again, and has surrounded himself with war hawks who are also repeating this. And this is a continuation of the Biden administration, and before that, the Obama administration's policies towards China. The United States has been building up its military thousands of miles away from US shores, surrounding, encircling, and encroaching upon China based on this false narrative that the US has created. This is to China what weapons of mass destruction were to Iraq. So people who think that Donald Trump is going to transform US foreign policy, he isn't. He's simply playing his role to continue advancing it uninterrupted. Now, each pillar has a subchapter. Okay, so if we look at Pillar 6, deliver peace through strength and American leadership, and you come down here, this chapter 28, 29, 30, 31. So let's go through these chapters in turn. So chapter 28, establish an America First foreign policy. From January 2017 to January 2021, America's pragmatic, interest-driven, transactional engagement with other nations, coupled with strong pro-American economic and energy policies at home, helped make America more secure and more prosperous than at any point in recent years. America's foreign policy approach left other regions of the world more stable and peaceful, and it established a complete and urgently needed reversal of US policy towards communist China. So in other words, ramping up toward conflict with China, not away from it. By doing so, the Trump administration was able to protect Americans from systematic theft of intellectual property, guard against espionage on American university campuses, lessen trade imbalances, and when COVID-19 struck American shores, hold communist China accountable. Because if China couldn't detect and warn the world of some outbreak within its own borders, when that outbreak reached the United States, America's inability to detect it and contain it is still somehow China's fault on the other side of the planet. Try to account for that logic. The Trump administration initiated robust efforts to address the threats from Russia and Iran. So China, Russia, Iran, all identified as as threats to America, just as under the Biden, Obama, lefty, liberal agenda, and just as identified by the neocon deep state, if that's what you want to call it, as well. Indistinguishable. The same three targets of U.S. aggression abroad, whether it's Obama, whether it's Biden, and also whether it's Trump. And it's being explained to you in black and white here. So the Trump administration initiated robust efforts to address the threats from Russia and Iran, including sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So we're always talking about how President Biden blew up Nord Stream 2 to punish Germany for refusing to cut its ties with Russia. But people forget that it was under the Trump administration that the United States began leveling sanctions against German companies for cooperating with Russia. This was the United States dictating policy to Germany, a foreign nation on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So it is the exact same meddling, just wrapped up in somewhat different rhetoric, but not really. I mean, not from where I'm sitting. It doesn't seem any different to me. It seems pretty obvious. It also oversaw the initial transfer of lethal aid to Ukraine to bolster its security and sovereignty.
We put up a lot of money. I gave you anti-tank busters that, frankly, President Obama was sending you pillows and sheets. And I gave you anti-tank busters. And a lot of people didn't want to do that, but I did it. And I really hope that Russia, because I really believe that President Putin would like to do something, I really hope that you and President Putin get together and can solve your problem. That would be a tremendous achievement.
Restored a needed strategic deterrent against the Iranian government through the maximum pressure campaign. I have said often that while President Biden is blamed for this ongoing war in Ukraine, he is certainly presiding over it. He has certainly enthusiastically poured gasoline on this fire. It was under the Trump administration that lethal aid began flowing to Ukraine. This was almost certainly the red line that was crossed that convinced Russia to launch the special military operation. They couldn't launch it immediately, instantly. It took time to prepare. Even when they launched it, I don't think that they were fully prepared, but they were as prepared as they believed they could be to meet the time constraints that they faced. So they launched it. It just so happened that the Biden administration was in power. But it began under the Trump administration with the lethal arming of Ukraine's military forces. Before the Trump administration, the Obama administration overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and began building up Ukraine's military. Under Trump, they began arming it. And by the time Biden took office and was in power, Russia launched the special military operation as a response to all of this, from the Obama to the Trump to the Biden administration. All of their actions combined compelled Russia to react. Trump holds equal responsibility for presiding over this. I don't think that it was his policy. I don't think any of these policies are the policies of those actually in the White House. But they preside over it, and they could speak up against it, but they don't. So just reading this from the America First Policy Initiative, you can see that actually, in reality, if you don't close your eyes and cover your ears, the Trump administration is indistinguishable from all the other administrations that came before and after it. And nothing, absolutely nothing President-elect Donald Trump has said has given me any reason to doubt he will continue this for another 4 years, which is where we come into this update on Ukraine. Ukraine is losing. This proxy war has completely run its course. No matter who won the presidential election, the U.S. would need to divest from Ukraine. They would either need to divest or they would need to escalate through direct intervention. And as a matter of fact, although we do not know exactly what proposal President-elect Donald Trump will make to Russia to end this conflict in Ukraine, all of the proposals that are being discussed, and this does not mean that these are the actual proposals, but all these proposals discuss some sort of freeze. There is no proposal that I have heard, and I've heard nothing from Donald Trump himself, that he's going to recognize that this is a U.S. proxy war provoked by the United States, that Russia was simply reacting to, that the United States needs to divest not only from Ukraine, but from NATO, a military alliance that exists solely to encircle and contain Russia within its own borders, which would be unacceptable if it was the other way around, and it is unacceptable for the United States to target Russia in this manner, and it needs to stop. I've never heard Donald Trump say anything about that. As a matter of fact, elsewhere on this America First Policy Initiative website, they brag about how during the previous Trump administration, President Trump convinced Europe to spend huge sums of money on NATO, to boost spending on NATO, this source of the actual problem, rather than divest from it. So there you have it. I just want to talk about a couple of other things before I get into the update on, because it's important that you understand the continuity of foreign policy that has taken place during the last 4 years of the Trump administration and are being promised to us if we listen with open ears for the next 4 years. So it talks about Chapter 29, maintain the world's most powerful military force. This is not about addressing the fact that the U.S. has a global spanning military. It has no right to have stretched around the globe in other people's territory, including amid illegal occupations, that it should bring its military forces home. Yes, it should have a powerful military, but it should exist solely to defend American territory. Instead, they use the same little trick that all the establishment elite use. They talk about defending American interests, which means anything that interests America in other people's territory. That's what they use their military to help themselves with. So that's under Chapter 29. Then there is Chapter 30. Pursue a bold new path to peace and prosperity in the Middle East. You tell me how this is new or bold. Oppose the elevation of the Palestinian Authority by reopening a U.S. consulate for it in Jerusalem. Oppose provisions of U.S. assistance to the Palestinian Authority until it ceases support for terrorism. Expand and build upon the Abraham Accords by deepening military and commercial ties. So just profiting militarily from this strategy of tension the U.S. itself has created in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, you could say that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I don't believe that is a legitimate resistance organization. The Palestinians have a legitimate right to resist, to take up arms against the Israelis, who are recognized by the UN under international laws, occupying their territory. But Hamas itself is not a resistance organization. Hezbollah is. Ansar Allah is. The militias that Iran supports across the Middle East are. Hamas is not. And I've explained this many times why it is not and how it has fought alongside other US, Israeli, Persian Gulf proxies in the region. If you're going to talk about the Palestinian Authority not supporting terrorism, you also need to address Israeli terrorism. The pager attack across Lebanon was a blatant terrorist attack, an indiscriminate terrorist attack that killed mostly civilians and children who had nothing to do with even the civilian section of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah being an entirely different organization separate from Hamas. Let's continue. Oppose any effort to agree to a new nuclear deal with Iran that is worse than the JCPOA, which was always from the beginning, before the Obama administration announced, it was always a ploy to make the world believe the US was seeking diplomatic solutions. They were going to sabotage it, blame its failure on Iran, and use that as a pretext to pursue maximum pressure against Iran, which ironically took place under the Trump administration. The Trump administration, the Obama administration began that policy. The Trump administration completed it. Restore the previous administration's maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian government. Well, you remember the Biden administration vowed to restart the nuclear deal. They did no such thing, because that was never the plan. The plan was always to sabotage it, abandon it, and then pursue regime change in Iran through maximum pressure. And so even though the Biden administration never used the term maximum pressure, they are right now in the middle of waging a proxy war against Iran through Israel, where unprecedented attacks are now taking place. Work to counter BDS efforts nationwide. Boycott, divest, sanction products made in Israel. This is a personal choice that Americans have the right to make. They have the right to boycott, divest, and sanction anything that they want. They are not obligated to patronize anyone that they do not want to patronize. So we always hear about how the lefty liberals are stealing, stripping away our personal freedoms. But here is a vow, a promise to strip away your personal freedoms if you personally decide you don't want to invest or spend money on or in any way financially support the Israeli government and its policies. Continuing, refrain from rejoining the United Nations Human Rights Council and restoring funds to United Nations Relief and Work Agency until those organizations institute a balanced and fair treatment of Israel. In other words, ignore Israeli atrocities, ignore their brutalization of the Palestinian people. Push for greater integration of Israel into U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, to include coordination with allies in the region in countering Iran's malign influence and activities. So all this is a continuation of the neocon war against Iran. And the war against Iran is not because Iran poses a threat to either Israel or the United States in any shape, form, or way. Iran has now demonstrated, without doubt, over the last year, tremendous restraint in the face of repeated acts of war by Israel against Iran. What Iran is an obstruction to U.S. primacy over the Middle East. This goes back to this from 1992. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. Well, Iran is a rival, and they want to eliminate that rival. That is their problem with Iran. Not that it is a threat to them in any legitimate way. It is a threat to their primacy over the Middle East, thousands of miles from American shores and borders. So this is what the Trump administration has done over the last 4 years it was in office, and this is what it is vowing to do again over the next 4 years. So just open your eyes and open your ears and accept that this is what will happen. Get ahead of the betrayal that is coming for everyone who voted for Trump. Now, finally, let's get to chapter 31, and then I will get on to Ukraine and why the U.S. was getting out of Ukraine one way or the other, regardless of who won the election, and all the narratives that are being formed to scapegoat, make excuses, and basically account for why the U.S. lost in Ukraine. But let's do chapter 31 of this America First policy initiative. Holds communist China accountable, fully accountable, for chronic unfair trade practices, stealing American technologies, and polluting our planet's air and oceans. And what this actually is, when you honestly assess this, it is complaining about China outcompeting the United States, out-innovating the United States. Anything Chinese people make that looks advanced must have been stolen by the superior white Americans and Europeans. It has to be. They couldn't have possibly have done it themselves. Well, they did. Claiming that China is stealing American technologies. Did they literally steal all of America's high-speed rail, which is why there's not even a single mile of high-speed rail anywhere in America, and China has the largest high-speed rail network on planet Earth? That is it because they physically, literally stole it from the U.S.? And this polluting our planet's air and oceans, this is so ironic because these same people will be climate change skeptics, which is okay. You can be skeptic. You can be skeptical about climate change, but then to twist it around and then blame China for something you're otherwise skeptical of just shows how malicious your actual agenda is, how disingenuous it is. Then it continues even further. It says, China is also a consistent aggressor against the free and democratic island of Taiwan. You show me anywhere on planet Earth where anyone officially recognizes Taiwan as a free and democratic country. You will not find it. Not even in the United States government. You will not see any single document that states this. And I'm going to prove it to you in just a moment. But let's continue. The People's Republic of China subjects Taiwan, which also is home to 90% of the world's advanced computer chip production, well, not for long. Not for long, to political, media, and psychological warfare, and has openly stated that it is willing to conquer Taiwan with military force if necessary. We must provide Taiwan with the latest military equipment and training so its people can defend themselves. So even as people place all of their hope into President-elect Donald Trump to end the US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. He is engineering a US engineered proxy war against China in China's island province of Taiwan. Now let's get to that. That's really important for people to see for themselves. If you go to the US State Department's official website, under a section titled US Relations with Taiwan, you will see that they unequivocally state the United States does not support Taiwan independence. If Taiwan has no independence, it means it's a dependent of someone or something. It is a dependent of the People's Republic of China. It's officially recognized under international law as part of China. And you would say, well, Brian, that's because Biden's in office. But actually, this is from 2019 when President Trump was in office, okay? So let's read through what this says. It says, the 1979 U.S. People's Republic of China joint communique switched diplomatic relation recognition from Taipei to Beijing. In the joint communique, the United States recognized the government of the People's Republic of China, that would be in Beijing, as the sole legal government of China, acknowledging the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. And this is what every single nation around the world's one China policy states. There is one China and Taiwan is part of China. There's one legitimate government of all of China. That's the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And I just showed you the part where it says the United States does not support Taiwan independence. So what is this that the Trump administration is proposing and had pursued during the last 4 years Trump was in office and will pursue the next 4 years he's in office? This is recognizing Taiwan as part of China, agreeing with Beijing that Taiwan is part of China and that the US will respect Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, while then turning around in practice to violate Chinese territorial integrity, its sovereignty over Taiwan, encouraging a separatist administration on Taiwan, arming it, and engineering a proxy war against the rest of China. That is what the Trump administration is doing, and it's only just continuing what the Biden administration had done these last 4 years, what Trump had done his last 4 years in office, what the Obama administration had done 8 years before that, and so on and so forth. This has been ongoing, an ongoing point of contention between the US and China. It is the US provoking this. This is an act of war. The US has troops in Taiwan, despite recognizing it officially as part of Chinese territory. So anyone who believes that Trump is breath of fresh air, who's going to change everything, he is not. He's simply telling you that because they understand the American people are starting to realize something is wrong. They are opposed to foreign intervention and endless wars abroad. He has to pretend that he's going to bring it all to an end, but what he's actually doing is simply doubling down on all of it, absolutely all of it. Now let's get into the situation in Ukraine, because people will say, well, he's getting us out of Ukraine, isn't he? Well, he was getting the United States out of Afghanistan, if you remember, during his 4 years in office. I mean, the process was not completed. It continued under the Biden administration. It was actually the Biden administration ultimately who withdrew from Afghanistan, but it was already ongoing all throughout the Trump administration. Was that because the Trump or Biden administration realized that that was a flawed foreign policy? They realized that it was wrong to occupy another nation on the other side of the planet, and that they should leave? Have they reformed their worldview? No, they were leaving Afghanistan because they needed the resources for the upcoming proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. And so now we are in Ukraine conducting a proxy war against Russia. The plan was always to try to weaken Russia at Ukraine's expense. Keep that in mind. That's going to come up here soon. But it has run its full course. The United States has exhausted its stockpiles. It has no more support, meaningful support it can provide Ukraine. Ukraine is in the process of losing, and this process is accelerating. The US and Europe cannot expand support to Ukraine. It's physically impossible. They have reached the physical limits of what they are able to produce and send to Ukraine. And let's go over a few examples of this. Number one, this AP article, Russia blasts Ukraine with more aerial attacks as part of an intensified campaign. This is November 8th, 2024. Russian missiles, bombs, and drones battered 3 regions of Ukraine and targeting nighttime attacks, officials said, as Russia mounts an intensified aerial campaign that Ukrainian officials say they need more Western help to counter, even as doubts deepen over what Kiev can expect from a new U.S. administration. Help has already been exhausted. What they're talking about is air defense systems. The U.S. does not produce enough air defense systems or interceptors to send to Ukraine. That is why this is happening. They have run out. They have exhausted their supplies. And Russia now has the upper hand in the skies over Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country needs more help to fight back against Russia's military might, even as uncertainty deepens over what Western aid Ukraine can expect after Donald Trump was elected this week as the next U.S. president. But as I have pointed out for months now, U.S. and European support has been in decline because of physical, not political limits. It is important to act together and decisively at the international level every time Russia tries to destroy our lives, Zelensky wrote on Telegram. This is the only way to achieve a just peace and stop the deaths of our people. Russia launched about 2,000 drones at Ukraine in October, just October alone. About 1/3 more than the previous month, making it the 3rd month in a row that there was a significant rise, the UK Defense Ministry said. Russian fire rates have climbed since the middle of the year, it said, adding that the latest high monthly numbers will likely become the norm. So there you go. On all fronts, Russia outguns Ukraine and is burying Ukraine in artillery shells, missiles, and drones. What about trained manpower? How about this from Defense One? Pace of war shortens EU-based training for Ukrainian troops. Now, if you followed my updates, this was just November 6th, 2024. If you've been following my updates over the last couple of years, I've talked about how difficult it is to train even entry-level infantrymen, how long it takes to do it properly, and how military units are not just entry-level infantry fighting on the battlefield. They have to be organized into units. The units need well-trained and experienced leadership, and if you are suffering catastrophic casualties, if you are losing men faster than you can train them and faster than they can gain experience, you will begin a cycle, a downward cycle of deteriorating trained manpower to the point where you will never be able to get ahead of it again. You will lose the conflict. So this is what it says. As the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine grinds into its 3rd year, Ukraine is in desperate need of experienced troops. I've been warning about this for probably 2 years now. Western military training, like that seen in Poland, could be the answer. No, it cannot, and they will explain themselves why it cannot. Western officials say their high-quality training, which emphasizes initiative, is a key advantage that their armies have over Russia. This is a myth, and it has been thoroughly debunked by what is manifesting itself on the battlefield as I speak. Polish staff, Ukrainian trainers, and Ukrainian soldiers say the effort is bearing fruit. Can you see how the effort is bearing fruit? I cannot see how the effort is bearing fruit. If we look at this article from the New York Times, October 31st, 2024, Russia's swift march forward in Ukraine's east. It looks like the rate of Russian advance and its taking of Ukrainian-held territory is exponentially rising. So I really cannot see how it's bearing any fruit. Then the article repeats this myth that Russia is losing astronomical numbers of troops dead and wounded, and Ukraine is only suffering a fraction of that. But then in their own article, they will contradict all of that by explaining how badly exhausted Ukraine's trained manpower actually is and how Russia is easily outfighting them. Russia has lost as many as 600,000 soldiers wounded and dead. This is baseless. We've talked about this many times before. That figure exceeds the Russian army's estimated ground strength at the beginning of the war, 360,000 troops. And it is the most casualties Moscow's armies have suffered since Soviet losses in World War II. But it's not true, so no, they haven't. Ukraine's losses have also been high, with an estimated 80,000 dead and 400,000 wounded. the Wall Street Journal reported, but based on what? Many units are exhausted, operating with fewer troops than they need and desperate for ammunition. Russia, meanwhile, is using its superiority in munitions and personnel to break through Ukrainian lines in areas that had once been secure. Well, they were secure because they had trained manpower armed with weapons and ammunition. Now they no longer have that. Russia does have that because their losses aren't anywhere near to what is being claimed by the collective West. That is war propaganda, obviously. So to solve this deficit of trained manpower, this is what the article says. The US and its allies in NATO have worked to replenish Ukraine's losses through training. Among the largest efforts is the EU Military Assistance Mission, EUMAM, which coordinates EU member states' efforts to train soldiers. And I've talked about this, how these training efforts are done by EU troops who have never experienced anything like what is happening in Ukraine. So they're incapable of preparing Ukrainian conscripts for war in Ukraine. In 2023, EUMAM's staff in Poland trained 10,528 troops. Poland is aiming to train some 12,000 troops in 2024, 1/5 of the EU's overall goal of 60,000 troops. 60,000 troops. Ukraine is probably losing 60,000 men dead or injured in probably less than half a year. Take that and compare it to, say, the 30,000 Russians being recruited each month, according to the Western media. So let's get back to the article. It says the multinational mission in Poland runs specialist training in which medics, sappers, artillerymen, tank crews, and other specialized soldiers refine their skills or gain new ones. It also operates leadership courses, including training for platoon leaders, non-commissioned officers, battalion staff officers, and brigade staff. Western officials sometimes frame non-commissioned leadership training in particular as the secret ingredient in Ukraine's successful defense early in the war. But what about now? The EUMAM mission in Poland also runs collective training for squads, platoons, and companies. I've talked about how long this actually takes to do versus, well, you'll see how long they're spending to do this training, in which soldiers learn to work with each other and other types of units like mortars. The mission also began running basic training courses in August. So then it starts talking about timelines. But Ukraine's desperate need, so here we go, but Ukraine's desperate need for more troops warps training in ways that weaken their effectiveness. So they're admitting it up front that this training is happening at an accelerated rate and it's happening at the cost of weakening effectiveness. Most courses run for just a month or slightly longer. Far shorter than the multiple months that Western militaries devote to similar types of training, according to a briefing slide, sometimes years of training. Collective training for squads, platoons, and companies runs for 1 week each. Ukraine sets those timetables based on their needs. The deputy commander of the Polish EUMAM mission said, but the EU can't train all the necessary skills in just a month, the commander said. Consequently, training must focus on what the soldiers need to have, he said. If we could have more time, then we will provide more types of training and it will be more complex, obviously. So let me just explain to you what a basic US Marine goes through. 3 months of basic training. Every single Marine goes through 3 months of basic training. And then if you're an infantryman, you're going to go through up to 3 more months of intense combat training. If you are a US Marine who is not going into infantry, you have some other specialty, you'll be fixing equipment, driving trucks, doing whatever, before you go to that specialty school, you will first go to about a half to a month-long combat training program called Marine Combat Training. By the time you get done with your specialty school, half a year to up to a year, or perhaps even longer than a year, may have passed. I was an electro-optical ordnance repairman. I went through 3 months of basic training, 1 month of Marine combat training, and 9 months of specialty training. So it was over a year before I actually got to the fleet and started actually doing my job. And when I got there, I still hardly knew how to do anything. And I suspect the same can be said for these Ukrainian conscripts. Then the article talks about brigade training. A brigade is 4,000 men strong. Obviously, I don't think they're training 4,000 men to operate as a brigade. This is more involving training officers to lead a brigade. It says part of the training are drawn from the U.S. Military Decision-Making Process, MDMP, a guideline for managing staff. The process rests in part on the U.S. Army's practice of mission command, in which soldiers are given objectives and given broad authority to achieve them in whatever way they see fit. Its effectiveness relies in part on trust that soldiers are well trained enough to make decisions on their own. The practice contrasts with historic Ukraine military doctrine, which emphasizes detailed command, in which commanders are expected to plan military operations down to the last detail and soldiers are given less initiative. The U.S. system requires highly trained soldiers to operate effectively, said the Ukrainian brigade staff trainer. Soldiers in the U.S. system rely on years of training and, most importantly, experience, particularly for non-commissioned officers and officers who spearhead military operations. Ukraine, though, has only weeks or at most months to train soldiers, and brigade staff training is just 21 days. Just 21 days. The units the brigade will lead have just a few weeks to train in complex combined arms operations. MDMP works when armies have experienced sergeants or commanders, the trainer said, but when you have a lot of casualties, such a system can break. And it is obviously broken, and we can see the effects of that manifesting themselves on the battlefield. The exponential increase in Russian-controlled territory. Then it says, but manpower isn't the only issue for Ukraine, noted a Ukrainian liaison officer at the EU MAM headquarters. Perhaps the greatest challenge, though, is the supply of equipment, they said. So all of these problems, shortages of manpower, equipment, ammunition, is already ongoing, has nothing to do with a new US president cutting Ukraine off. It is this whole process has already begun to collapse. It's just a matter of making excuses, cutting and running, or escalating. Ukraine can draft and send many more of its men, but without more weapons and vehicles to replace those lost in the war, Ukraine would not actually be able to arm them. If you see how the war goes, every day we have losses, not only in soldiers, but in equipment, he said, obviously. And there's only one way which we have to replace what is damaged. That means deliveries from partner nations, our industry, he said. Our industry is not very big, and it turns out the West industry is also not very big. So if you take all of these factors together, Ukraine is already losing, irreversibly losing. There's nothing that can be done for Ukraine on its own to turn this conflict around. The only thing the collective West can do is either divest from Ukraine and focus its resources on a much larger, more dangerous war with either Iran and or China, or they can try to freeze the conflict and establish a Western-occupied buffer zone somewhere in Ukraine, just like they did in their failed proxy war in Syria, which was, again, a U.S. proxy war that transcended multiple U.S. presidential administrations. The Bush administration had begun preparing for it. It was initiated during the Obama administration. It continued under the Trump and Biden administrations. And the occupation of eastern Syria was done as a measure to salvage what was a failed U.S. proxy war against the Syrian government. It failed. And instead of withdrawing and admitting defeat, they have frozen it in a way with this U.S. occupation of eastern Syria. And we remember President Donald Trump having no problem with that at all. As a matter of fact, we remember him vividly bragging about stealing the oil, stealing Syrian oil in the middle of an illegal occupation.
So we want to worry about our things. We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil. The oil is, so valuable for many reasons. It fueled ISIS, number one. Number two, it helps the Kurds because it's basically been taken away from the Kurds. They were able to live with that oil. And number three, it can help us because we should be able to take some also. And what I intend to do, perhaps, is make a deal with an ExxonMobil or one of our great companies to go in there and do it properly. Right now, it's not big. It's big oil underground, but it's not big oil up top. Much of the machinery has been shot and dead. It's been through wars, but and spread out the wealth. But no, we're protecting the oil.
with securing the oil. I want to bring our soldiers back home, but I do want to secure the oil.
And then finally, the Western media is busy spinning narratives to blame the collapse of the proxy war in Ukraine on the incoming Trump administration, just like the collapse of the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan was compartmentalized with the Biden administration, even though withdrawing from Afghanistan began under the Trump administration. Trump's return is terrible news for Ukraine. Europe should step into the breach, but will it? The more important question is, can it? And the answer is obviously no, they cannot. They do not have the military industrial capacity to step into the breach. The US already clearly does not have it. The European Union most certainly does not have it. They collectively do not have it. So Europe on its own most certainly doesn't have it. And if you go through this ranting opinion piece, he's talking all about European unity, political and defense unity, but nowhere in there does he address military industrial production. You can have all the money in the world, all the political will and unity in the world to aid Ukraine, but if you don't have factories pumping out shells, rockets, missiles, air defense systems, then all of this other intangible support is meaningless. And I think that's what the collective West's ruling class is now starting to realize, that they have severely neglected industrial production, the tangible means of exercising power. Then we have this from CNN, very much in the same vein. Ukraine is forced to confront a brutal Trump reality that it hoped would never happen. Trump may appoint a cabinet that mildly adjusts the pace or tone of his instincts, but in the end, he wants out. In the end, it is obvious the uniparty, the unelected special interests in the United States realize they cannot win this proxy war in Ukraine. The goal was always to weaken Russia at Ukraine's expense. They have succeeded in doing that to a degree, but now their means of perpetuating this have been exhausted. So they either have to escalate or they have to divest. And it's as simple as that. And it didn't matter whether it was Trump or Harris who won the presidential election. They would begin a process of either divesting or escalating. It doesn't matter that strategically, so this is CNN saying this, doesn't matter strategically, Ukraine's war has so far provided the Pentagon with a comparatively cheap means of degrading the second greatest adversary at no cost to American life. Well, first of all, that could be debated. Second of all, can you imagine saying that, watching Ukraine being physically and entirely destroyed, its population dying on the battlefield, or being driven out of Ukraine as refugees? Could you imagine callously saying that it's all to degrade Russia, who is not threatening the United States in any shape, form, or way? On the other side of the planet, it should be pointed out. And it's being done in a way that doesn't affect American life. Who cares about Ukrainian life? It's not affecting American life. That is what CNN is saying here. Then it says success in Donetsk. They're talking about Russian success in Donetsk could leave the path to major cities like Dnipro and Zaporozhye wide open, making the Ukrainian capital suddenly very vulnerable and likely tipping the scales of the war. Yet the clock has been ticking on Russia's efforts. Western officials have suggested that its casualty rate of perhaps 1,200 dead or injured a day is unsustainable without another major unpopular Russian mobilization, and that next year, Moscow could see a genuine crunch in armor production and ammunition, a genuine crunch, unlike the imagined crunches, I guess, that the Western media has been reporting since the beginning of the special military operation of Russia running out of armor and missiles next month. They've been saying that every month for about 3 years now. This time it's a genuine crunch coming next year. And then this is how the CNN article ends. And the CNN article, the Guardian article before it, and many others, it's all in a very similar vein. It says, one vital lesson of the war will meanwhile face a grave assault. For the past 2 years, Putin's fiercest opponents have pushed the key idea that we need no longer fear Russia, that the Kremlin fanned the fear of its hulking bear as a psychological weapon to make up for its military decrepitude. Ukraine's unexpected resistance showed that fear was misplaced and that Moscow has struggled to defeat a neighbor it once scorned as unable to fight. And yet, here we are, and this is what is happening on the battlefield right now. We have to remember, it wasn't just Ukraine fighting against Russia by itself. It had the collective backing of the US, all of NATO, in Ukraine from 2014 onward, building up its military forces. This is what precipitated Russia's special military operation in the first place. And then it says, now a Trump White House may ask the world to quickly swallow an apparently similar contention that is terrifyingly different, that the West should not be afraid of Russia as it does not really mean much harm. That would be Putin's greatest victory and the West's sorest weakness, which really, the whole article is incoherent. The one in The Guardian is also incoherent. None of these articles are discussing the physical limits to what the West can do to perpetuate this proxy war any longer. They never actually explain how Russia is actually a threat to the collective West. They just hope that you assume that it does and you believe that it does. The problem here is that an incoming Trump administration is not trying to end the conflict in Ukraine because it understands that this conflict is a US proxy war. It is part of this greater foreign policy stretching back decades of ensuring no rivals develop. That is why there is a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia right now. That is why the Trump administration has in the past and vows to continue supporting separatists on the island province of Taiwan against the rest of China. This is why the Trump administration has played its role in the past and vows to play a role in the future to continue confronting, encircling, containing Iran in the Middle East. It's all in pursuit of ensuring no rivals develop, and those that have developed are eliminated. That is what is happening. The Trump administration, and had he lost the election and it was a incoming Harris administration, they are trying to do damage control, to pivot away from Ukraine, just like the US had to pivot away from Afghanistan and prepare, summon, collect, refocus their resources on the next war that they are speeding towards, and that is with Iran and or China. You have to remember that this is not a matter of an incoming Trump administration undoing something the Biden administration did, the creation of this proxy war. Trump, during his first 4 years, contributed to this proxy war. He helped set the conditions that set it in motion. And he was just one part of a much longer agenda, doing this all the way back to the Bush administration at the beginning of the 21st century. This was a concerted, continuous agenda of politically capturing Ukraine and turning it against Russia. And it has culminated in this destructive war and this complete destruction of Ukraine. And now that it has run its course, they need to find a way to get out of it. And as they always do, when you have a new administration coming in, it's just a matter of speechwriters coming up with a narrative that is palatable for at least half of the American and Western public. So that is what they are doing. They hope you swallow it and put your faith into the Trump administration, that this is just a sign of greater change to come, when in fact it is a warning that the US will simply be doubling down on this policy. Instead of in Ukraine, we will be fighting in the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific region. For us to truly fix what ails America and its foreign policy, we have to truly understand it. We have to understand what interests are driving it. And we have to look honestly and objectively at the incoming administration, the people that Trump has once again surrounded himself with. We have to look at them and see which interests are driving their decision-making. And why has Trump once again surrounded himself mostly with war hawks? None of these wars are justified. All of these wars are, again, a product of this unwarranted foreign policy. The US is not entitled to presume dominion over planet Earth. It is entitled to presume dominion over what resides within its borders, and that alone. Everything else is an overreach. Everything else, every nation on Earth, including Iran, North Korea, China, and the Russian Federation, they have a right to fight back. They have a right to defend themselves from this encirclement, from this containment, this encroachment, this subversion, these proxy wars, and the threat of all-out war with the United States. President Trump, were he genuine, he would identify this fatal, fundamental flaw in U.S. foreign policy, and he would vow to change it. For people who remember U.S. Representative Ron Paul, he had at one point run for president. He got nowhere close to winning the election for obvious reasons. And the obvious reason was because he outright said the U.S. has no business abroad. Its military should be brought back within U.S. territory, and it should defend the United States. The idea of defending U.S. interests abroad means imposing yourself on other nations within their sovereign territory or along their borders in ways the U.S. itself would never accept another nation doing to it. And he said, you sent these troops abroad easily enough, you can bring them back. That was something he would have repeatedly said. And it resonated with the American people, but it does not resonate with the people it needs to in order for you to actually win a primary and take part in the presidential selection, not election. The presidential elections work by always making sure two candidates, regardless of who is chosen, will continue advancing U.S. foreign policy. This foreign policy right here. And if you go to the America First Policy Initiative and you explore their foreign policy proposals, it is a modern day reflection of this neocon agenda articulated by the New York Times all the way back in 1992. I wish it wasn't true. It is true. I will continue keeping an eye on all of this. And no, I'm not saying that Kamala Harris was an alternative. I'm saying it did not matter who you voted for. The only thing that's going to change is the face you have to look at while you're being lied to, and perhaps small superficial details about the lies you're being told, and maybe possibly the excuses supporters of whoever was elected into office will make for why their candidate they helped put into office is now betraying their campaign pledges. That is the only thing that is going to change. If you thought this update was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on YouTube, Rumble, and Telegram. I'm also up on X. I also have my own blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. I put all of my articles and videos up on there. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video. You can go to the America First Policy Initiative and you could read it for yourself. You could see for yourself. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms, including YouTube. I do not monetize it. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no extra resources to spare and you're just helping share my work with others, all of that is greatly appreciated. That is what helps me do my work. So thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.